Brother Johnny, and I just want to give all honor and praise to the Honorable Silas Muhammad for your long-standing, long-distance runner on this issue of reparations from way back in the day. So thank you, and thank you for the Afro-descendant nation for inviting me to make this special presentation. So, the human cargo was loaded on ships at a bustling wharf in the nation's capital, destined for plantations in the deep South. Some of the enslaved people pleaded for rosaries as they were rounded up, praying for deliverance. But on this day, in the fall of 1838, no one was spared. Not the 2-month-old baby and her mama, not the field hands, not the shoemaker, and not Cornelius Hawkins, who was about 13 years old when he was forced on board. The enslaved were grandmothers and grandfathers, carpenters and blacksmiths, pregnant women and anxious fathers, children and infants who were fearful, bewildered, and despairing as they saw their families and communities ripped apart by the sale of 1838. Some children were sold without their parents, and the enslaved were dragged off by force to the ships. Others ran away before they could be captured. Their panic and desperation will be mostly forgotten for more than a century, but this was no ordinary sale of enslaved people. The enslaved human beings had belonged to the nation's most prominent Jesuit priest, and they were sold, along with scores of others, to help secure the future of the premier Catholic institution of higher learning at the time, today known as Georgetown University. So, what happened to these 272 men, women, and children who were literally sold down the river? And what, my brothers and sisters, if anything, is owed to the descendants of those enslaved and the descendants of the millions of others whose names and circumstances we will never know, who were sold or insured or raped or castrated or lynched or subjected to gynecological experiments with no anesthesia, convict leasing, forced sterilization, syphilis, red line, police murders, mass incarceration, and more. What is owed, if anything, to the descendants of the enslaved whose kidnappings and torture and uncompensated labor helped to ensure the survival of colleges and universities, banks and corporations and industries and religious institutions and private estates and, yes, local, state, and the federal government. Thank you for allowing me to share as part of my opening, framing an excerpt from Professor Rachel Swan's article published in the New York Times on April 16, 2016, chillingly describing the sale of 272 enslaved persons that ensured the future of Georgetown University. But unlike Georgetown University and Jesuit revelations, where there was a ship's manifest with names, there is rarely evidence of identifiable descendants from the enslavement era from which to highlight not only the atrocities of the era, but its continuing vestiges and seek acknowledgement and remedy. Why is that evidence not manifest? Okay. Over the past decades, when I'm usually asked to talk about the issue of reparations, I'm asked to address the history of the movement and my involvement. Why? Likely because during the 1970s, I sat at the feet of and personally learned from many who we now herald as U.S. reparations legends and now ancestors: Queen Mother Audley Moore, Brother President Imari Abubakari Obadeli, Attorney Chokwe Lumumba, Queen Mother Dorothy Lewis, Brother Hannibal Afrique, and more. They taught me stories of Marcus Garvey, Callie House, Isaiah Dickerson, Belinda Sutton, Tunis Campbell, Pat Singleton, Henry McCabe, about General Sherman's 40 acres and a mule, and his inspiration from Southern black preachers. What I learned did not come out of books, because by and large this information was, and much still is, whitewashed from popular history. In those early days, during the dawning of the modern era of the reparations movement, Mary Frances Berry had yet to pen "My Face is Black is True" about Callie House and her role in spearheading the National Ex-Slave Mutual Belief Bounty and Pension Association, which has several 100,000 dues-paying members seeking to obtain compensation in the form of pensions for the enslavement from federal agencies. Brother Ray Wimbush had not yet written Belinda's petition, then first record of a formal petition for reparations that was pursued and won in Massachusetts. Caleb McDaniel had not researched the case of Henrietta Wood, who successfully sued her former enslaver's estate, receiving, although a pittance, the largest yet settlement against an estate. There was no widespread information about the 1921 massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which left over 300 African Americans, Afro-descendants, good with me, new Africans, it's all good, dead, and thousands homeless after mobs of white people attacked the Greenwood community known as Black Wall Street. There was scant research in the public domain on Ida B. Wells Barnett, who uplifted the hard issue of lynchings. The role of the Catholic Church in serving and saving Georgetown University from bankruptcy through the sale of 272 human beings had not yet been exposed, and the only people giving Queen Mother more legitimacy during those days were the radicals. The 13th Amendment, passed in 1865, was supposed to represent progress, as the bill recognized the freedom of all enslaved Africans and made it illegal to continue slavery except for that ridiculous "except as punishment for a crime" clause. However, there was still pain. There was no payment for stolen labor, land, rape, economic exploitation. In fact, the Dred Scott case had been decided scarcely 8 years prior, 1857, where the United States Supreme Court ruled that a black person in America had what? No rights, which a white person was bound to respect. And neither Dred Scott nor any other black person could be a citizen of the United States in the manner in which that word was used in the Constitution. And the 14th Amendment, it imposed the obligations of U.S. citizenship upon the African in America without the benefits of that citizenship and without any meaningful discussion of political alternatives inherent in the international right to self-determination. The audacity. How are you going to take a free people and tell them that they've got to become part of your family? Especially since you had castrated his father, raped his mother, sold your children off to your relatives, didn't ask if she wanted to join your family, be a U.S. citizen, didn't ask if he wanted to start his own family. If the African was free, pursuant to the 13th Amendment, no one, not even the ex-enslaver, could define the African's future status for him and impose a status upon him. This was the right of the newly freed people, the Africans alone. It was a fruit of the international right to self-determination. It is one of the pillars of reparations, which is still due to us today. And Brown versus Board of Education, thank you for reminding us that today was that day, May 17, 1954. Progress. My analysis as to why that Supreme Court case was even saw the light of day in 1954 was because of the historic 1951 petition to the United Nations filed by the Civil Rights Congress and led by William Patterson, W.B. Du Bois, Mary Church Terrell, and 90-something others, charging the United States with what? With genocide. Rather than be subject to scrutiny by the world community, the decision was made to desegregate the schools with the now infamous quote-unquote all deliberates speed clause. And the final areas that's supposed to denote progress worthy of applause were the Civil Rights Acts of 1957 and 64, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Well, the 1967 Civil Rights Act 57-1 featured the longest filibuster in history, but Senator Strom Thurmond. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was introduced only after Birmingham, Alabama, police unleashed dogs and fire hoses on black men, women, and children peacefully protesting. And the Voting Rights Act of 65, key provisions have been eviscerated. And just this year alone, 49 states have introduced over 400 bills to restrict voting rights. So yes, there are lingering adverse effects and impacts from the enslavement era which persist throughout the United States today. But no, more progress is not what is needed. What is needed is reparations, reparatory justice, reparations that addresses the multifaceted harms that have been inflicted, that call for multifaceted remedies, reparations to remedy the present effects of past discrimination, reparations not to reconcile the contradictions created by the white nation's founding fathers, but reparations to expose the contradictions and move forward towards amends. But we cannot know. Oh,
Hold it.
I'm talking too loud.
It's right there.
Okay, can we put it up here? Yeah, let's do that. Because I am a loud. I probably don't even need the microphone. Can y'all hear me okay? Okay, thank you. But the problem is we don't know our history. Much of it has been buried or glossed over, misinterpreted, or just plain old obliterated. And what do we need to do? As I always say, we gotta open up that casket. Our history must not be buried. It must not be swept under the rug. And for our white allies, we, the descendant victims, must not be the only ones to uncover and open up that casket and unpack it. In fact, I have a colleague, Katrina Brown, white, who uncovered evidence that her ancestors were the largest slave trading family in U.S. history. She documented her roots, that they brought over 10,000 Africans to the Americas in chains in a film that she produced, Traces of the Trade, a story from the deep north, not the deep south. She was in Massachusetts. This is what she said. Everyone in the town, see, people try to say this was just the South thing. She said everybody in the town lived off of slavery. The boat maker, the iron worker who made the shackles, the coopers who made the barrels to hold the rum, the distillers who took the molasses and sugar and made it into the rum. Literally, she said the whole town in the North was dependent upon the slave trade. Wealth and privilege in the United States, she said, has been amassed in large measure as a direct or indirect consequence of the institution of enslavement. Yes, the demand for reparatory justice in the United States has been long and continuous. And quiet as it's kept. Reparations were in fact paid as slavery ended. They just weren't paid to black folk. Okay? Reparations were paid to the former white slave owners to compensate them for the loss of their so-called property, us. We need to open up that casket. Indeed, do you remember what then Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said after the historic reparations hearing in the House of Representatives in 2019? He said, quote, "I don't think reparations for something that happened 150 years ago, for whom none of us are currently living, are responsible. I don't think that's a good idea." McConnell, who is a direct descendant of great-grandfathers on both of his family lines who owned slaves, the nerve, the absolute gall. I'm sorry, I'm just saying, there's a lot about Haiti in the news today, but we're not taught that reparations were paid by them after they successfully fought the British, French, and Spanish armies and established the first black republic in the Western Hemisphere. Reparations were not paid to them, but an independence debt that saddled revolutionary revolutionary Haiti with reparation payments to its former slave owners in France. I don't even, let's look at Britain. The British government paid reparations totaling 20 million pounds, equivalent to some 300 billion pounds in 2018. Not to us when they abolished slavery in 1833, but to the former white slave owners. And right here in D.C., April 16, 1862, Abraham Lincoln signed the Compensated Emancipation Act. Not to compensate us, no, but to compensate the former white slave owners. So, as I'm coming down, let's see, why the federal government, people have asked. Wasn't the injury done all by the states? Well, I just want us to take a quick look at the U.S. Constitution. U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Clause 1, Section 9, expressly guaranteed and sanctioned the continued importation of kidnapped African prisoners of war, that's what we were, to every state that might desire us until the year 1808. That article also upheld the further dehumanization of the African by relegating our status to that of 3/5 of a white man, and most egregious, the African on this soil was subjected to the authority of yet another constitutional provision, Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3, also known as the fugitive slave provision, which mandated that no enslaved person, even if he or she had reached a free state, none of us was safe. And it was the duty, the legal obligation, the constitutional responsibility of every white man, woman, or child to track down the escaped African, deliver him and her up to the government. You see, this is why redress from the federal government is so very important. In addition to all of the other culpable entities, every time we ran away, it didn't matter if we just slipped away quietly in the night, Harriet Tubman. It didn't matter if we organized elaborate insurrections, Jim Marbeezy. It didn't matter if we fled to Pennsylvania or New York. They were going to come after us with their armed forces and their paddy bowlers and their militia and their dogs. And that is why it's so important to connect the dots between what is happening and what is going on. Let me just say this. I recently spoke on reparations before the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, which I issued a resolution in support of H.R. 40, the Federal Reparations Bill. And I told them that there was one thing I learned from the Jewish experience. I said, no, it wasn't the more than $70 billion in reparations the German government paid to more than 800,000 Holocaust survivors, or the $7 billion Germany agreed to give to the the illegal settler colonial state of Israel. No, it was the concept of transgenerational epigenetic inheritance. It was a study that was done on third-generation Holocaust survivors where researchers found that they had inherited genes that had been transformed as a result of their ancestors' trauma and were becoming more susceptible to anxiety and other disorders. It was found that the trauma from the Holocaust traveled in their genes, transmitted intergenerationally, and I began to think, centuries of trauma as a result of not only the enslavement era, but also everything else. If the Jewish Holocaust caused immense emotional, physical, and psychological effects intense enough to cause traumas to survivors, then what is the impact on living Black people today due to the horrors and brutality, trauma, and terrorism of the enslavement itself, the kidnapping, the forced-free labor, the stealing of our languages and culture, the rapes, the breedings, the dismemberment, the brutality and inhumanity of the Black codes, the convict lease labor, the peonage system, the chain gangs, the sharecropping, the lynchings, the harms of Jim Crow, apartheid, denial of the benefits of the Homestead Act and the GI Bill, the gerrymandering, the redlining, the educational inequities, the health disparities, the mass incarceration, and more. And all of this, for 400 years, or however one wishes to measure the time, all of this still exists within the collective genes of Black people in this country. Why shouldn't the great-great-grandchildren of those who were stripped of humanity, language, and culture, and all of those other things that I said, who were stripped of land and massacred wholesale in Black enclaves such as Rosewood and Tulsa and Elaine and Wilmington and more in the section, why should we not be compensated? I'm going to just skip this because I am trying to be courtesy of time. Let me just say, I'm just going to say that caskets are opening up across the country, uncovering more and more evidence of historic racial atrocities, lynchings, massacres, with entire Black communities burned to the ground and decimated. Mere scraps were given to the descendants of the 1923 Rosewood slaughter, and there still has been no settlement on behalf of the 1921 Tulsa bloodbath and destruction of his Black Wall Street. Not one of the recommendations from the 2000 commission investigating the 1898 racial insurrection and coup d'etat in Wilmington, North Carolina was passed. We need to Google up some of this stuff, y'all, by the legislator. Remnants from the slave ship Clotilda, which in 1860 illegally transported Africans to Mobile Bay, Alabama, more than 50 years after the slave trade was abolished. The descendants today are still seeking amends. Countless companies and industries benefited and were enriched from the profits made as a result of the trafficking in human beings. There are companies that sold life insurance policies on the lives of enslaved persons such as Aetna, New York Life, and AIG. Financial gains were accrued by the predecessor banks of financial giants such as J.P. Morgan Chase and Bank of America. I know a lot of us got mortgages from these crooks. Others with documented ties to slavery included railroads like Norfolk Southern, CSX, Union Pacific, Canadian National. Newspaper publishers that assisted in the capture of runaway persons included Knight Rider, Tribune, E.W. Scripps, and Gannett. The casket is still being opened. In conclusion, my heart is full. There is unquestionably a racial reckoning happening in this country. The winds of change are shifting, y'all, in favor of reparations. The casket is being thrust wide open. There are increasing examples of historic harms being uncovered with initiatives to right wrongs as we speak. A month does not go by without me hearing of new manifestations of vestiges from the enslavement era to be addressed. Reparations is not history or a thing of the past. Reparations is about historical injustice, and until justice is done, reparations will always be relevant. It will always be a righteous